Okay, okay. Sound check for the stenographer. 1, 2, 3. Sound check for the stenographer. 1, 2, 3.
Let me know when you're ready. Witness mic check, testing 1, 2. Audio for the reporter. Testing, member mic check for the reporter. Test, test, test.
Mic check for the stenographer. Mic check for the stenographer. 1, 2. Witness, mic check for the stenographer. Member, mic check for the stenographer. Member, mic check for the stenographer. Yeah. Member, mic check for the stenographer. 1, 2. 1, 2, 3, 4. Member, yeah.
The Subcommittee on Housing and Insurance will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled Housing Solutions, Cutting Through Government Red Tape. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chairman for inclusion in the record. With that, and great apologies to our witnesses and frankly all of our colleagues, votes are called on the floor, and so we will recess. We'll reconvene right after votes, and then we'll get through as much as we can before Benjamin Netanyahu addresses a joint session. If there's work for the committee following the address, that will be a recess to go cover that. And then we'll adjourn after Benjamin Netanyahu's address is complete and finish the work of this hearing. So hopefully that gives everyone the lay of the land. With that, the committee stands in recess. The Subcommittee on Housing and Insurance will come to order. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. Today's hearing is entitled Housing Solutions, Cutting Through Government Red Tape, which, as the name implies, is all about what we can do to make it easier to bring new housing units online and available for Americans. This is a goal that I'm sure all of our witnesses and colleagues here share today. As we have heard repeatedly throughout the dozen-plus hearings this subcommittee has held this Congress, the cost of housing is increasingly out of reach for far too many Americans. Today, we will explore one of the biggest drivers of unaffordability, which is layer upon layer of federal, state, and local bureaucratic rules that do little to improve the quality of housing stock while adding additional costs, construction delays, and raising the barriers even higher. Let me give you just one example of what our housing providers are up against. Many of the challenges are local. Some local problems are so bad that they grab national headlines. So for the record, the story of the New York Times back in January, San Francisco tried to build a $1.7 million toilet, and it's still not done. That was the headline of the story, and as it states, 15 months after the city officials were ready to throw a party to celebrate funding for a tiny bathroom with a toilet and a sink, nothing but mulch remains in its place. The toilet project broke down the minute taxpayers realized the city was planning an event to celebrate $1.7 million in state of California funds that local politicians had secured for a 150-square-foot structure. $1.7 million for a bathroom is about 8 times the median home price back in Ohio's 8th District, in a home, I would say, that has multiple bathrooms. So why is it going to cost so much? As the New York Times states, quote, even more confounding was the explanation that the tiny bathroom would take 2 to 3 years to install because of the city's labyrinth of permitting and building process. Governor Newsom later took back the funds, and residents dubbed the saga Toiletgate. The story goes on to state that it takes an average of 523 days in San Francisco for a developer to get the initial go-ahead to construct housing, and another 605 days for building permits. You can't make this stuff up. So Toiletgate is just one example of government red tape run amok, and in this case, state and local problems, but some of the problems are federal. Take this chart behind me. When a developer stays focused on the private sector, this bottom portion in gray shows the process. You don't have to look at all the steps to know that's a pretty efficient process. It takes up just not even 10% maybe of the whole sheet of paper there. But when they try to use federal housing choice vouchers, look at the top portion in white. Look how convoluted that process is, and you're supposed to offer it for the same price. Well, obviously, it's going to take more overhead to use the upper portion of the flow chart than the lower portion of the flow chart. So instead of working to make things more efficient, federal bureaucrats are working to add more cost and complexity and even more uncertainty. For example, HUD and USDA are working on IECC energy code rules, and one of their more recent boondoggles to create yet another rent control project to standardize apartment buildings. All these factors increase costs and decrease supply. Lastly, federal bureaucrats want to focus on everything but the mission in housing. Things aren't going well in federal housing programs, but now they're being directed by the Biden administration to engage in voter registration and setting up ballot drop boxes in HUD properties. $0 are actually appropriated by Congress for the purpose of voter registration by HUD. HUD's supposed to focus on housing. So to accomplish the mission, maybe start with focusing on the mission and maybe take note of lessons learned. We don't need more rent controls or bureaucracy which cap investment or limits. We need more supply. So with that, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I yield back the balance of my time. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee on Housing and Insurance, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, for 4 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for their patience. Hopefully, we won't be interrupted again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. These housing hearings have been rare under the Republican majority, even given the housing crisis. And here's what I think. You and your side don't want to acknowledge that the Biden administration has been focused on mission and has made tremendous progress and committee Democrats have also helped in making that true for working families. Thanks to the pandemic relief and new appropriations by Democrats, the Biden-Harris administration has helped keep over 12.4 million people housed. Let me repeat that. That was a big part of the mission, 12.4 million people housed. Since 2021, the Federal Housing Administration has helped nearly 1.8 million individuals become homeowners. This includes 1.5 million first-time homebuyers, the highest in 23 years, and 2.2 million total first-time homebuyers across the Ginnie Mae portfolio. And it's not just homeowners. The administration recently announced a plan, subject to congressional approval, to withhold tax benefits from corporate landlords who raise rents by more than 5% per year. This plan ensures that corporations and private equity lobbyists can't force working families out on the street just to make a quick buck. We have heard from the chairman, and you will hear from their side, that the real problem is federal regulation and that HUD is stopping growth in America, that energy standards are burdensome. I'll get to federal regulations in a moment, but I want to note that many of the regulatory burdens are at the state and local levels. We should support efforts to reduce those barriers where appropriate. That's why Ranking Member's historic housing package includes funding to help communities reduce these barriers. But the chairman won't give that package a vote because, well, it's a Democratic proposal. While we propose solutions, Republicans, meanwhile, sit back on their hands and wait for the private market to act. But here's a news flash. If the private market was going to save us, they would have done that already. Without necessary federal subsidies, it's virtually impossible for developers to build homes affordable for low-income or extremely low-income families. Instead, they build luxury homes. That's where they can make the money. And that leads to low-income people living in old substandard housing that is not up to code, and then they have to pay on it for more. 3 national laboratories found that during prolonged weather-induced power outages, modern energy codes can reduce deaths to extreme heat by 80%. Reduce deaths by 80%, and extreme cold by 30%. And that's before the energy savings. My district is still recovering from Hurricane Beryl. People in my district died because of the heat. Many could have been saved if they lived in homes built to better codes. And if the federal government is going to back these mortgages, then they should be in safe homes, period. We will continue to prioritize affordability and stability over profits and people over politics. We must fight against Republicans' Project 2025. It is not about getting families into safe, affordable homes. It is about taking total control of removing checks and balances that protect our constituents. Look it up and see for yourself. I yield back.
Thank the gentlewoman. The chairman now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee. The gentlewoman, she's not here, so we can't recognize her. So with that, today we welcome the testimony of our witnesses, the Honorable Paul Compton. Mr. Compton is the managing partner of Compton, Jones, and Drescher. Carl Harris. Mr. Harris is co-founder and president of Carl Harris Company, managing partner of Harris Homes, and chairman of the National Association of Home Builders. We have Linda Couch. Ms. Couch is the senior vice president of policy and advocacy at Leading Age. And I will turn it over to my colleague, Mr. Fitzgerald, to introduce our final witness.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to introduce James Schamer, CEO of Continental Properties, which is headquartered in Menominee Falls, located in the 5th Congressional seat in Wisconsin. Continental has developed more than 34,000 apartment homes and currently owns and operates approximately 22,000 homes in 14 states. Mr. Schamer received an MBA from the University of Chicago and a bachelor's degree in accounting from Valparaiso University. He is the chair of the National Multifamily Housing Council and serves the boards of West Bend Insurance Company and Whole Child International. Thank you, Mr. Schamer, for being here, and I yield back.
We thank each of you for taking your time to be here today, and each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Without objection, each of your written statements will be made part of the record. Mr. Compton, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give your oral remarks.
Chairman Davidson, Ranking Member Garcia, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify and share my perspectives on government red tape and its adverse impact on housing, and particularly affordable housing in the United States. My name is Paul Compton, and I practice law at the intersection of real estate, taxes, securities, and banking for the past 30 years. After my confirmation by a bipartisan Senate vote in 2017, I served as general counsel of the Department of Housing and Urban Development under Ben Carson until 2020. Since that time, I've returned to private practice, focusing on affordable housing and commercial real estate. At the outset, it is my view that there are hundreds of federal government red tape impediments and tens of thousands of state and local ones, some spurred by federal requirements. And these are like the tiny ropes that hold down Gulliver in the classic Gulliver's Travels. It's not necessarily just any one of these, but is the cumulative burden which I believe keeps flat on its back the market forces and entrepreneurship which could otherwise make housing much more abundant and less costly in the United States. In many cases, it is not the requirements or expense of the red tape itself directly that is the chief impediment, but rather the enormous cost and time which these impose. These costs really, in my view, fall into three different buckets. First, it's the cost that is directly imposed for professionals and for reviewing and coordinating them. Second, there's the time value of money, simply the cost of beginning development, the investment, the risk that's involved. And third, as time stretches on, those risks become much greater, and what is required for return in order to justify that effort goes up. Simply put, bad things can happen during delay, such as increased cost, higher interest rates, land sellers who lose patience, investors who find other opportunities, and downturns in the economic cycle. But having identified the issue in a broad sense, fashioning a remedy without metaphorically giving Gulliver death by 1,000 cuts or banishing all the Lilliputians as we try to strip away those tiny ropes is a great challenge. I believe the best course is, while we do snip away at some of those lines as we find them, is that we need to fashion a way to have checks and balances in what has, at least on the local level, been runaway regulation during the past 40 years. Studies show that local regulation has more than tripled over this time. Perhaps not coincidentally, the growth in regulation has occurred since individuals and small businesses were economically pushed out of the market by the 1986 Tax Act. Indeed, the Reagan 86 Tax Act brought us the low-income housing tax credit, a temporary provision at the time, which was intended to help offset the recognized impact on the housing market that passive activity loss limits would create. Indeed, Secretary Carson and I used to laugh that we were trying to administer the Department of Housing and Urban Development, but the largest housing program to create affordable housing in the United States was being run by the Internal Revenue Service. The most problematic tax provision is the so-called passive activity loss limitation in Section 469 of the Internal Revenue Code. It essentially means that only widely held C corporations have the economic incentive to invest in real estate. Thus, my principal and first suggestion, especially as Congress will soon turn its attention to the expiration of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, is to restore the ability of individual investors and closely held businesses to invest in local real estate. This would reconnect the local political process that adopts and changes and implements regulations at the local level with more accountability. For instance, this could be done in a way that is more targeted, that requires these investors to live within proximity of the investments they're investing in. Finally, let me just tick off a few other things that could be addressed. First is the application of the National Environmental Protection Act to FHA loans. As you know, FHA loans, or NEPA, is a paperwork act. Second, abolish so-called mixed-wage decisions. And finally, reconsider and do away with choice-limiting activity.
Thank you, Mr. Compton. Mr. Harris, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give your oral statement.
Thank you, Chairman Davidson, Ranking Member Garcia, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the National Association of Home Builders. As a small business owner in a heavily regulated industry, I know firsthand how challenging and costly it can be to comply with government regulations. Home builders face substantial regulatory hurdles that impact housing production and affordability. These regulations make it increasingly difficult to meet our goals, and additional mandates will further hinder the ability to provide affordable housing. The nation is currently facing a housing affordability crisis. Housing costs are rising at an unsustainable rate, making it increasingly difficult for average Americans to afford a home. Additionally, we are experiencing a shortfall of 1.5 million housing units, a gap that continues to widen each year. This crisis is worsened by various factors, including rising construction costs, regulatory burdens, and limited availability of buildable land. We are constantly challenged to balance the rising costs of material, labor shortages, and the regulatory landscape, all of which contribute to higher home prices and rents. We must do better to ensure that Americans, including workforce families like members of the armed forces, teachers, first responders, have access to affordable homes in the communities they serve and live. Amid the ongoing housing affordability crisis, rent increases have garnered significant media attention, sparking calls for rent control. However, this reactionary approach is fundamentally flawed. It fails to address the root cause of the crisis, the insufficient housing supply. Rent control will not build a single new unit of housing to alleviate this shortage. This deeply misguided policy will deter investment in multifamily housing and will lead to deferred maintenance and deteriorating property conditions. Unfortunately, the administration has succumbed to this false appeal of rent control by proposing a nationwide rent cap of 5% per year for landlords who own more than 50 units. These rent caps will hurt existing tenants, those that the president is trying to help, because owners and developers will be unable to cover the rising costs of rents if rents are fixed. Most concerningly, this plan will discourage developers from building new rental housing. Apartment supplies will fall, and ultimately lead to even higher rents. Another prime example of costly government red tape is the recently adopted rule that requires all newly constructed homes financed by HUD and USDA to comply with the 2021 IECC. This energy code can add as much as $31,000 in additional cost to the average single-family home. This mandate offers minimal utility savings while significantly increasing housing costs, especially in the entry-level market. HUD and USDA should assist vulnerable home buyers and renters, not price them out of the market. This policy will deter new construction at a time when increasing the housing supply is crucial to lowering shelter inflation costs. Thank you, Chairman Davidson, for introducing HJ Res 170 that will allow Congress to overturn this harmful rule. And even more alarming is FHFA is considering applying a similar standard for homes financed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which provides 72% of the financing of new home purchases. This would set a de facto nationwide energy code, severely disrupting new home construction, intensifying the housing supply shortage, and negatively impacting affordability. Any mandate that limits the availability of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac financing for new construction to only those homes, new homes and apartments that meet the 2021 IECC is counter to their charge. This move will reduce the affordability financing options for low and moderate income home buyers seeking newly constructed homes, compelling them to buy or remain in older, less efficient properties. According to the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, upgrades to existing housing stock could yield a projected reduction of 5.7% of the total U.S. electricity consumption by 2030. If we want to make a difference on energy efficiency, we must focus on older housing rather than making new, already energy-efficient housing affordable for many American families. Thank you for this opportunity. We look forward to working with you.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Mr. Schlomer, you're now recognized for 5 minutes for your oral statement.
Thank you. Chairman Davidson, Ranking Member Garcia, and members of the subcommittee.
Is your mic on?
Excuse me. Thank you. Chairman Davidson, Ranking Member Garcia, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Jim Schamer. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Continental Properties, and I'm Chair of the National Multi-Housing Council. My firm is a national developer and operator of multifamily properties targeted to serve households earning 80 to 120% of area median income. Over the past 23 years, Continental Properties has developed over 129 apartment communities encompassing more than 34,000 apartment homes in 19 states. This morning, I'm here on behalf of the nearly 100,000 combined members of the National Apartment Association and the National Multi-Housing Council. Multifamily housers are committed to working with Congress and the administration to address America's housing supply crisis. Our goal is to ensure that apartment providers can meet the long-term housing needs of the 40 million Americans who live in apartment homes. Challenges present themselves differently from community to community, but it will come as no surprise that we are facing a widespread housing affordability challenge. The cause is simple. The solutions are not simply put. We do not have enough housing. The only way out of this supply shortage crisis is to build more housing. Basic economics proves that more supply serves to keep prices lower. Estimates indicate that we will need 4.3 million new apartment homes by 2035. While we are at historic levels of apartment completions in this calendar year, Census Bureau data shows that new starts are down nearly 35% this year, which could lead to even greater shortages in coming years. Regrettably, the current political, economic, and regulatory environment makes building new homes incredibly difficult. Increased material, labor, insurance, and state and local tax expenses have increased costs dramatically. Research has found that many regulations can go far beyond ensuring the health and well-being of the public, and that regulation imposed by all levels of government account for an average of 40.6% of multifamily development costs. Unfortunately, policymakers are considering a multitude of proposals that negatively impact the addition of housing supply, including those targeting AI, broadband, rent control, evictions, financial and criminal screening, service fees, energy efficiency standards, and building codes. None of this would increase housing supply. Worse, some of the proposals, including the administration's plan to ban internet bulk billing, will raise costs for residents that we serve. Rent control is another harmful proposal, including the misguided and counterproductive plan offered by the administration to cap rent increases at 5% annually. That's far below an 8% increase in per unit costs that we saw for operating costs in 2023. Decades of research show that rent regulation devastates rental housing quality and harms affordability. Time and time again, research by independent economists demonstrate that rent regulation will not add a single new unit of housing and, in fact, worsens housing availability and quality. Don't just take my word for it. Last week, Jason Furman, former President Obama's chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, said to the Washington Post, and I quote, Rent control has been about as disgraced as any economic policy in the toolkit. The idea we'd be reviewing and expanding it will ultimately make our housing supply problems worse, not better. Douglas Holtz Eakin, the chief economist of President Bush's Council of Economic Advisors and formerly a director of the Congressional Budget Office, wrote, "There is absolutely no justification given for the 5% cap on rent increases, nor is it tailored in any way to local housing market conditions. It's just a blunt, across-the-board price control delivered with Thor-like delicacy." We can solve this challenge. Congress must prioritize increasing our nation's housing supply and support pro-housing policy that will, in turn, ensure greater housing stability and affordability for renters at a variety of income levels. Congress should work with the administration to implement initiatives like the administration's Housing Supply Action Plan that address challenges in the development of new housing. For example, the administration should reward jurisdictions that have reformed zoning and land use policies with higher scores in federal grant-making policies.
Thank you, Mr. Schamer, and we'll consider the rest of your stuff as submitted for the record. Ms. Couch, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give your oral statement.
Thank you, Chair Davidson, Ranking Member Garcia, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Leading Age is a national association of more than 5,400 mission-driven nonprofit aging services providers, including affordable housing providers, nursing homes, home health, hospice, PACE, and other types of senior living communities and providers. In the districts of this subcommittee alone, Leading Age's 197 members serve thousands and thousands of older adults every year. Our nonprofit affordable housing provider members provide quality housing and rely on federal programs for the resources they need to serve older adults. The average annual income of a HUD-assisted older adult household is $16,262. Affordable housing for these households means rent and utilities are no more than $375 a month. For any developer, for-profit or nonprofit, the math does not work without public subsidy. Despite the strong programs used by our thousands of housing provider members, today's programs are no match for existing and growing needs. After decades of retrenchment from investments that strove to meet needs, HUD's 3 largest programs serve almost 300,000 fewer households today than they did in 2004, and meet the needs of only 1 in 3 eligible older adult households. In its most recent worst-case housing needs report, HUD told Congress that 2.35 million older adult renter households with very low incomes spend more than half of their incomes on housing, an increase of 60% since 2011 and an increase of 130% since 1999. The biannual report, delivered to Congress since the 1980s, was to be the canary in the coal mine, to warn Congress of the nation's most pressing affordability challenges. The challenges, for example, that would foretell rising homelessness so that Congress could respond and act accordingly. But within 6 months of receiving the newest report, Congress zeroed out funding to build and operate new Section 202 supportive housing for the elderly homes. Subsidized homes, which exclusively serve the very low-income households suffering under severe housing cost burdens at the heart of the worst-case needs reports. A devastating impact of watching worst-case housing needs rise without commensurate resources and action is upon us. The number of older adult households with chronic patterns of homelessness increased by an alarming 73% between 2019 and 2021. Today, older adults are the fastest growing population of people experiencing homelessness. And what about all the resources we've poured into HUD and other programs over the years? We love these resources and we celebrate them, but they are not enough. Waiting lists for affordable senior housing provide key insights. A member of ours in Minnesota is just now serving people who joined their waiting lists in 2015. A member in Middletown, Ohio, has people on their waiting list who applied in 2021. Other members in both rural and urban housing markets told us about the absolute normalcy of waiting lists of 2 to 6 or 7 years long. A member in Manhattan, New York, opened 150 spots on their waiting list in September 2023 and was inundated by 10,100 applications. As one member of ours told us, I find the most disheartening thing about our long wait lists is the fact that people have no idea that the wait list is so long until they are in desperate need of housing and cannot wait. In other words, it is unconscionable for many older adults that in their greatest time of need, the federal housing safety net is in such tatters. Breaking down barriers to affordable housing development is important, and getting rid of exclusionary and racist zoning and permitting laws is critical. Leading Age supports, for example, the Pathways to Removing Obstacles housing program, which just provided its first grants to state and local governments to create higher density zoning laws for rezoning for multifamily housing and to reduce land use restrictions. In closing, while addressing regulatory barriers and red tape is important, doing so does not absolve the federal government from committing the resources necessary to restore and shore up the safety net for housing. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate our witnesses and your opening statements. We'll now turn to member questions. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questioning. I've heard from many housing industry practitioners that they're facing death by 1,000 cuts when it comes to complying with federal, state, and local regulatory regimes. I'd like to start by asking all of you if we could wave a magic wand, what are the top 1 or 2 policy changes that Congress should consider that would be appropriate at our level? And I'll just start with Mr. Compton. You mentioned, some of the caps in the tax code, and of course, part of the challenges we face as committees of jurisdiction to solve a whole problem, you might have to cross jurisdictional lines, so it's hard to get that kind of collaboration, but maybe you could highlight, in particular, the caps problem.
Well, Mr. Chairman, with respect to the tax provision, that is the elimination of passive activity losses generated by real estate depreciation from being claimed. I think that that's a long-term fix, certainly something that, as you correctly pointed out, crosses lines, but with the upcoming reconsideration of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, this does seem a time at which that is something that could be put in the mix as that act is reconsidered.
Thank you. Others? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would have to say stop. Stop adding on additional regulations. Currently, we think that 24% of the cost of a new house is directly related to government regulation, most of that at the local level. So that equates to about $93,000. If we do these energy code adjustments, we add another somewhere between $7,000 and $31,000, depending on what numbers you use. Just stop. Stop adding on, and then we can start working with the state and local jurisdictions about the same.
Thank you. Mr. Schamer?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to recognize the fact that all of us in this room on both sides of the aisle and up here have the same objective. We are all seeking to provide more and better quality housing at all price points so that all Americans can afford to occupy quality housing. And there are a lot of ways, but let's start at perhaps the lowest income level of that chain with the residents who utilize Section 8 vouchers. And as you pointed out, Mr. Chairman, the process for a landlord to go through to lease an apartment to a Section 8 voucher holder is very onerous, and it expands both the time invested, but most importantly, the cost of that time. Apartments have to stay vacant longer while that process is followed, and that is an obvious cost. If we can expedite that process in a safe way to protect the voucher holders, we will all benefit in providing better quality housing sooner to that lowest tier income level of residents.
Yeah, thank you. And one of the challenges we also have is, local jurisdictions add, kind of extra layers to that, and particularly in the inspection process. Ms. Clark, or Ms. Couch, sorry.
Thanks for the question. That gives us a magic wand and lets us go outside of committees of jurisdiction. I think the low-hanging fruit is to expand the programs that we know work so well. If we're talking about expanding affordable housing supply, programs like HUD Section 202, Senior Housing Program, the Housing Voucher Program, right? We have just shortchanged these programs for decades, and I would agree with Mr. Schamer that housing authorities need the wherewithal, they need the resources to administer the voucher program, to do those inspections, to speed up people getting into those units. If I had a really large magic wand, I'd go ahead and encourage this Congress to make housing assistance and entitlement for the lowest income households.
Thank you. I want to turn to these new energy standards briefly. I wish I had a little more time, but Mr. Harris, is HUD required to publish some updated standards this year?
HUD was required, to my understanding, to look at the energy codes and to see if the introduction of an energy code into their program would affect both affordability and availability. They say no. We say, of course it did.
Of course they did. And as you point out, the range is, they spitballed it at 7,200, but depends on where you're at in the market. It could be as high as 31,000 if I take your statement. So clearly, if you raise the cost, it makes it less affordable. And look, I appreciate Ms. Couch. I mean, part of the challenge is that it's expensive, so maybe the natural inclination is if we subsidize it, we could make it better. Subsidies don't fundamentally change the market, and it doesn't drive the incentive to put the investment in. So I look forward to doing more on this and hearing the thoughts of all my colleagues. So my time's expired, and I now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And the United States continues to face one of the worst affordable housing and homelessness crisis in our nation. Recently, the Supreme Court ruled that localities can criminalize and punish homelessness, paving a path for an aggressive strategy of mass incarceration, which has always proven to cost more than building homes for people in need. Criminalization of homelessness does not work. The bottom line is we need more homes, and we need them to be safe and affordable. Mr. Harris, why are housing developers not building more homes, especially multifamily housing, that are affordable to lower income households?
Well, thank you very much, Congresswoman. I really appreciate the question. I think it's the market forces. It's the costs and uncertainty that are brought about by multifamily developers in our communities, because they may purchase a piece of land that is zoned for multifamily, but there are all kinds of hearings that increase costs. As the gentleman earlier spoke of, 41% of the cost of a multifamily property is directly related to government regulations. So if you take that 41%
Are those not
off,
government regulations that are mostly from the local level? City ordinances, city building codes,
we
city...
find that is correct, and so if the federal
Then what
government...
can we do if really it's the local level that controls the building of the structure itself?
I think if the federal government was to recognize and reward those companies that decrease those regulations in those communities, I think that you would find more developers willing to invest in those communities and invest in those low-income housing units.
How do you balance that concern with, for example, less than a week ago, our mayor in Houston put a halt to a Houston Housing Authority plan to move residents from a housing project to this development because of environmental concerns. I mean, he just flat said, we need to test it before we move people in. But you're saying stop.
I'm saying stop new regulations and let everybody catch up with what it is. If codes and regulations...
So you don't think my mayor should stop a development from going up if there's environmental concerns?
No, I'm unaware of what the mayor of Houston's process is, or that. I'm truly unaware.
Well, any
of that.
city that has an environment says that you've got to check property for environmental concerns, if there's a concern, you would say, stop, don't do that. You want to be able to just go and build.
No, that's not necessarily what I was saying when I said stop. I said, if we're going through the process, and they've already been permitted for the process, then why are we stopping a project that has been? And again, I'm unaware of the specific nature of the situation in which you speak of. But again, developers want to develop where there's certainty, right? So they just, and all of the uncertainty increases the cost of a project.
Okay, I'll move on then. Ms. Couch, while some may view this extra step as onerous, I hope we can agree that it's certainly important, especially after multiple projects were found uninhabitable in Houston after Hurricane Harvey. Given your work in Leading Edge, could you go into a brief detail just how important these environmental regulations are to ensure the safety of future residents?
Thank you for the question. Yes, environmental regulations, of course, protect people from all kinds of health and safety hazards, the worst of which happen when people are living in an environment day in, day out. And so getting the environmental safety straight before people move in, and if there are concerns, to address them as quickly as possible. Older adults, particularly the lowest income older adults, particularly non-white older adults, have more chronic health conditions, which are exacerbated by environmental air quality issues, by contaminants in the soil, et cetera. And so while it is no secret that environmental regulations at the state level and perhaps at the federal and more local levels might add time to moving people in and to developments coming to closure, the equation, right, it promises out, because safety first, and it is the only way to protect people from further environmental justice, and other downsides of not having strong environmental laws go hand in hand with housing development.
Mr. Chairman, I do have a couple more questions that I'll submit for the record, and I also would like to ask for unanimous consent to submit 2 documents. One is Chapter 15 of the Trump's Project 2025 Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise, which is on the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which essentially says,
Without objection.
well, I didn't tell you about the second one. You want to just,
Okay.
the second one is the U.S. is failing renters during extreme heat waves.
Without objection.
Thank you.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lukemeyer, who's also the chairman of the Subcommittee on National Security. Now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have here this morning today's Wall Street Journal, and as you can see down here, I have circled a graph that talks about home prices reaching record. This is the latest information for today. And that graph shows that home prices are now, the median home price is $427,000. It's more than doubled in the last 9 years, and roughly a little over 50% increase, significantly more than 50%, quite frankly, in the last 4 years. Also, so as a result, scratching on here is me taking into account here a 30-year loan on a $427,000 house at roughly 7% with a 10% down payment will leave you with a $2,800 monthly payment. Now, the people in my district, average wage is $56,000 a year. That doesn't compute. I'm sorry. The average person cannot buy the average home anymore. So we've got a problem. And so also in today's Washington Times, darn the fact we got these facts here this morning, isn't that interesting? We show that housing costs are still rising at a 5.2% annual rate, while our inflation rate is more around 3. Also shows that wages in residential construction is up 9.2%. Now, I'm sure all of you guys know that. I'm not telling anything new, but I think those are important facts to get on the record here. It shows there's a crisis here. You guys have talked about it. But the documents, the facts today that show that this is in the news today. So, you were talking, Mr. Harris, about some of the costs that are there, and the fact that 24% of a house now is government regulations. How do we find a way to get around that? I mean, how do we put affordability back in this for the people? I think a while ago you said stop the regulations, but I mean, we have other things beside regulations. We have inflation going on. So we want to know what Congress can do. Balance the budget, stop spending money, stop allowing the inflation to continue. You have some comments?
I do, and we're working with anybody to help address a number of cost issues. We partnered up with the American Planning Association, the National League of Cities, the Realtors, and NEHB, and they published what's called the Housing Supply Accelerator Playbook, in which the American Planning Association said, let's take a look at the way we've been planning communities and the additional cost that has been associated with that, which is local regulation and requirements. And they published this playbook. It's an easily downloadable PDF, and it talks about what local municipalities and planning groups can do to start unwinding some of that. And so when I said about stopping regulation, that's the stop. That means it's not increasing. And then let's go back and see what's actually needed. I serve on my local planning and zoning board. And so we were able to put these into account and get rid of arbitrary requirements that actually add to the cost of a house. And in one case, we were able to make a lot work for a triplex instead of a duplex, which lowered the rent $200 per month for those 3 families that will be in the triplex each. So I think there are positive things to do.
I appreciate your thought process there. You know, we got, according to the administration's own figures, roughly $1.6 trillion worth of new rules and regulations in the last 3.5 years, $1.2 trillion in the last 5 months. So we wonder why we have inflation, because that's like a hidden tax. It all has to be paid for by somebody. It's all got to be incorporated into the costs of doing business. Before my time runs out, Mr. Compton, I've got a quick question for you here. You've served in administration in HUD. I know that the HUD guarantees loans, and I've always been an advocate of shifting that risk to the private sector, because I would want your opinion here. Would it help make loans more accessible, make them more affordable, and help better administer the agency if you could pass that on to the private sector?
And with respect to pass on to the private sector, that is pass on the risk of
Take the
making...
guarantee portion and let the private sector, secondary market take care of it. Secondary insurance market.
Historically, the FHA's program has had solid underwriting and has financed itself. I must say, I generally come to these things with the attitude, if it's not broken, don't fix it. I think that is certainly, in terms of doing more risk sharing, is something that could be explored on a pilot project.
Gentleman's time's expired. I now recognize the gentlewoman from California, the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Waters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm going to direct a question toward Ms. Couch. The share of older adults in the U.S. is expected to reach 23% by 2050. This is a population that typically has greater disability needs and fixed incomes. It's no wonder, then, that we've seen a chronic undersupply of accessible and affordable housing contribute to a rising number of cost, burden, and homeless older adults. In fact, less than 1% of the housing stock is estimated to be wheelchair accessible. Given leading age work as a developer of affordable and accessible housing for older adults, what are some of the greatest barriers to integrated, accessible, and affordable housing?
Thank you for the question, Ranking Member Waters. To leading age, the greatest barrier is funding, right? We can build, but we're never going to be able to bring affordability unless we subsidize. So funding for subsidy is important, but also so are codes and rules or regulations or what have you that require some level of accessibility, particularly when there are public dollars in the development or in the substantial rehabilitation. As you said, almost less than 1% of our homes are wheelchair accessible. Less than 4% have, any of those three key things that most of us would think as accessibility friendly, right? Wide hallways and doorways, single floor living, no step entries, like some of the basics. And so we have virtually no truly accessible housing. I do think that HUD has a role in paving the way, that the federal government has a role in paving the way and bringing communities and developers along with it. If it were to do more to require what the Kelsey refers to as disability forward housing, and that means really meeting a variety of disability needs. As an aging nation, as a nation of a whole variety of people, we need our housing stock to be much more realistic, much less
I'd like
aspirational.
to, if I may just take a moment, I think what you're describing, I was just talking with my staff about. I'd like to give you an example.
Yeah.
I'm an older adult. I live in a house I've been living in for 25, 30 years. I'm on a fixed income. I don't have any money, but I don't have wheelchair accessibility. I need to have some, work done in order to be able to even enter my house. Where do I go? What do I do?
So the programs for home modification and accessibility features are piecemeal and they are underfunded, right? HUD has a relatively new program authorized by Congress a couple of years ago. A lot of state and local governments use home or CDBG funds for home modification programs, but they are random and, as I said, piecemeal. And we need these programs because we are not only aging in place, a lot of us are stuck in place. And so we need more modification programs. Most older adults reside in homes that they own or almost own and want to stay there. And to be able to do that successfully and healthily, we need to provide the resources so they can have that wheelchair access, they can have that single floor living.
And what if I'm renting and my landlord does not have the resources by which to do the development, redevelopment, the construction, or what have you? What do? My landlord doesn't have the money.
So there are certain things landlords have to do for reasonable accommodations, but in addition to those, Leading Age is proud that we worked to change HUD's older adult home modification program so that eligible recipients of those modifications, that the grantees, usually state and local governments, housing authorities, can be renter households.
Thank you for being here, and I hope that both sides of the aisle hear what we're hearing today. We all claim to love our seniors. We want to do everything for them, but this is a big gap in being able to have a decent quality of life if you can't get a house and if you can't get what you need to make it accessible to you. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentlewoman. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The problem of home affordability seems to be much more of a problem of supply and demand. Builders aren't incentivized to create enough starter homes or entry-level homes for younger generations to begin to build this wealth. I've been part of discussions between home builders in Wisconsin and some of the municipalities where they're on a carousel, continuing to kind of chase the idea of developing and building a new subdivision, and they can't come to agreement because of the cost of the homes. So one effort to reduce regulatory barriers that I'm aware of is Mr. Loudermilk has a portal for Appraisal Licensing Act, which would provide consistent licensing application and renewal procedures and background checks for appraisers. Mr. Harris, what are some of the other regulatory issues on the federal side that could be removed to reduce the cost of housing that you're certainly aware of?
Well, I think if we take a look at the federal side of the regulations, EPA, WOTUS, the Endangered Species Act, all of which add to the front-end costs of even just getting the permit or the development started, right? We talk about the $93,000 per house. It's really hard to build affordability or affordable properties, or what we like to call attainable properties, those that people can actually own on their own and start building family wealth, the kind that will stabilize families, stabilize neighborhoods, stabilize employee and volunteer bases. So we really think that if we take a hard look at those processes that add to the front-end cost, which usually means that you have got specialists and consultants, all of which you're paying for every meeting in which you meet with the city or the county about. So I think those are a good start.
Very good, thank you. Let me kind of shift gears here. Last week, the Biden-Harris administration announced a policy proposal that would prohibit landlords with 50 or more units from taking depreciation deductions if they raise the rent by more than 5% per year. Rent control policies have a poor track record of maintaining house affordability. Mr. Schamer, can you speak to the negative effects of such a policy, and what are those effects, and what would be the negative effects on housing supply problem that we're facing right now?
Thank you, Congressman. I'd be happy to address that. As I mentioned in my earlier remarks, there is a plethora of research that's been done on the impact of rent controls, on the detrimental impact that it has on new housing supply. I think a great current case study occurs in the twin cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. St. Paul adopted rent control a couple of years ago. Minneapolis did not. The construction of new apartment and new rental housing in St. Paul has ground to a virtual halt, while it has continued to grow in Minneapolis and the suburban areas that do not have rent control. Supply does have a huge impact. Why would that be a concern if to hold something to a 5% level? From January of 2022 through June of 2023, the cost for my company to develop a new apartment community, a new apartment home, increased by 42%. Rent did not increase anywhere near that number, even during a rapidly growing rent period of time. So for us to then create new housing in a market that will be under rent control tells us that we may not be able to keep up with our costs, and we have to find markets where that's not a restriction on our development. And that has been proven time and time again. It ends up impacting the quality of housing. People don't maintain housing because of the costs that they will incur relative to the rent increases that are out there. They're very tied together. And so the solution, as we've said before, is to create more housing, and I think we all agree with that. The question is, will regulation, will further burdens to cost, and yes, the representative is correct that much of that occurs at the local level and the state level, but there are incentives that the federal government can offer to prevent further regulation and to try and take some of that back, to increase density of housing, those kind of things, to allow more supply to be created.
Thank you very much for your answer. I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzgerald. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Our subcommittee has jurisdiction over housing and insurance. The most commonly heard complaint that I've heard about the cost of housing is the crippling cost of insurance. Property insurance, liability insurance, which has been rising rapidly at a rate that affordable housing cannot afford. And so I would love to hear from each of you, what are your thoughts on what can be done to rein in the upward spiral in insurance costs?
I guess I can start if you like, Congressman. Sure. Thank you very much for the question, and you're absolutely right. The cost of insurance over the last couple of years has risen far in excess of many of the other operating costs and of our revenues at our properties. The degree to which that is influenced by casualty insurance is one factor, and we have to find ways to rein in the inflation on construction costs as one of the ingredients to rein in the cost of casualty insurance. Another, as you mentioned, is in liability. And liability insurance has increased proportionately with the increase in liability costs due to the inflationary nature of settlements that are occurring. So there's a broad range of causes, and I think we all need to work together not only to rein in any kind of price gouging that occurs, but to look at what are the causes, the insurance increases in the first place. I'm aware that many casualty insurance companies today are operating at current ratios that exceed 100%, meaning that their losses are exceeding the amount of premium that they're earning. So there are a lot of causes that we have to look at in order to rein this in.
Ms. Couch?
Thank you for the question. Rising insurance costs are a gigantic issue for affordable senior housing providers, and I think for all HUD-assisted housing providers. We need, in the senior housing space, we need products that are tailored to affordable senior housing. Too often, insurance providers couch senior housing as a healthcare setting, which it is not. It is an independent living setting. But to meet rising costs, have to be able to buy insurance for their deductibles even, because the deductibles have gone so high. Our members are cutting their wellness programs, and not just to help pay for their rising insurance costs and their insurance on their deductible costs, but so that they don't get classified as having a wellness program, which is really counter to their missions to help residents age in place. We know that HUD is working really hard on this issue, trying to figure out what it can do for a largely state-regulated issue. We wonder, though, if HUD could be authorized by Congress to establish a property and liability insurance product of its own, so that the affordable housing programs within its universe could get some relief here.
The supply of senior housing is catastrophically lagging behind the need. America is in the midst of a silver tsunami, and we need to create enough senior housing to meet the needs of an aging population. According to a June 2024 report from Live On New York, there are more than 300,000 applications on the waiting list for HUD 202 senior housing, a program that is a shell of its former self. There's a narrative from my Republican colleagues that the government can only do harm to the housing market. It can do no good. I think economics tells us that when you subsidize something, you will get more of it. Ms. Couch, if we were to subsidize HUD 202 senior housing, would we get more of it?
We would have a lot more housing stability among older adults. We'd have a lot more units of affordable senior housing. HUD's Section 202 program is HUD's flagship senior housing program, and it has been grossly underfunded, and now it is zeroed out for new housing. And this program, in its heyday, did exactly what we would want an affordable housing program to do. It provided the vast majority of the capital subsidy to build the housing, and then, and what it still does today, is it provides 40 years of ongoing operating subsidy. So you're never too poor to live in Section 202 housing, and your rent is always affordable to you. So we are huge fans of the Section 202 program, and our members are too.
Yeah. And there's a real need for innovation in housing, like innovations, whether it be modular construction, vertically integrated modular construction, 3D printing, has the potential to drive down the cost of housing. So I think we should think about how do we make the process of constructing affordable housing itself more affordable.
Bring it. Yeah, we're ready.
And I see my time has expired. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Dela Cruz, who's also the vice chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Housing and Insurance, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today, and thank you to all the witnesses for appearing before us. Reducing government red tape is directly tied to increased private sector investment in our housing supply, which is a vital step to addressing the extreme housing affordability challenges working families are experiencing today. Communities like mine, which are working class and largely Hispanic, know all too well how much their housing costs them in their monthly budgets. And unfortunately, we know that the gap between median incomes and median home prices continues to widen. Removing unnecessary government-imposed costs on the housing ecosystem is a necessity as we continue to address housing affordability. And all levels of government must balance responsible legislation and regulation with the implementation costs. That being said, Mr. Compton, that is where I would like to start. Given your previous experience as general counsel at HUD, can you describe how HUD conducts cost-benefit analysis when analyzing new rulemaking?
Under applicable Administrative Procedures Act provisions, there is a required cost benefit that goes into formal rulemaking. I think, though, that the challenge that we have is that many of the things that are impediments, some of the ones that I have mentioned, such as choice limiting activity, mixed wage decisions, and for instance, tenant requirements concerning how criminal background checks must be conducted, are all sub-regulatory. So there has been no cost-benefit studies done on those items. Rather, they were simply imposed by fiat. And so I think that it is, once again, back to my Gulliver's example, it is not any one of those that is backbreaking, but it's the cumulative burden of those and things like them that really pose the challenge. So I think that what you would find is a very mixed bag as to whether any cost benefit is being done. And as Mr. Harris noted, the ones that are done often, in my view, vastly undershoot what the real cost is, because going back to the three categories I mentioned about the costs imposed by regulation, there is the out-of-pocket cost, and that's usually what the regulatory process will catch, but what it doesn't catch is the cost of time and the risk of time.
Let me ask you, Mr. Compton, as a general counsel for HUD, we talk a lot about government spending and government waste. Is there any government waste in HUD that we might be able to streamline to help us in this area?
Representative, the short answer is yes. There will always be that. I do want to say, though, I think we always have to come at trying to address waste in a way that is not itself counterproductive. Or we're going to spend more money stopping waste than what the waste cost. And I think that there are certainly times when we go overboard, and I think that a number of the regulations that we have are also symptomatic of that. We're trying so hard in the poster concerning housing choice vouchers to make sure that nothing is done wrong, and we check and we double check and we triple check, that we introduced enormous cost, both out of pocket and in delay, from trying to make sure that there's zero that's going wrong. At the end of the day, for instance, at HUD, we have the Departmental Enforcement Center. There are people and processes that are sometimes not going to work, and that's where enforcement comes in, rather than trying to build a mousetrap that never lets any problem happen. I think is many times just too expensive.
Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Williams, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was not expecting it to be my time when I saw Ms. Tlaib walk in. But I will take this 5 minutes because I am excited to talk about housing solutions today, y'all. Today, I want to focus on a slightly different issue than my colleagues and take time to provide a solution to an overlooked housing issue that is affecting hundreds of thousands of Americans. So for the witnesses that have joined us today, by show of hands, how many of you are familiar with heirs property, also known as tangled titles? No one. Well, we're going to have a little education lesson today. For those of my colleagues or those watching who are unfamiliar, heirs property is real estate that, as official government records indicate, is owned by someone who is deceased and maybe has been for multiple generations. And y'all, unfortunately, I am all too familiar with this issue as it has personally affected me, my family, and so many of my constituents. Heirs property represents a significant asset for many families, especially Southern Black families. Properly managing and formalizing ownership can contribute to closing the racial wealth gap by securing and leveraging these assets for economic growth. Many families in the Black community face challenges with estate planning, leading to situations where property is inherited informally and it is often recorded as heirs' property. This can complicate the transfer of wealth and hinder long-term generational wealth building. According to a 2020 study by the American Bar Association, approximately 70% of Black Americans do not have a will, compared to 45% of white Americans. The minimum estimate of assessed value identified heirs properties is $32 billion with a B, and that is across 44 states and the District of Columbia. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask for unanimous consent to enter this article from Brownstoner into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. The article describes how the property at 234 Jefferson Avenue in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, was subject to a partition sale due to one of the heirs selling an unspecified fractional share to an LLC, which then attempted and was successful in purchasing the entire property after several court cases aimed at forcing a sale. Partition sales like the one described in the article can undermine wealth accumulation for Black families by forcing the sale of historic and valuable properties. Imagine how devastating it would be to lose your family home of 75 years because of unrealized risk of heirs' property. Heirs' property often involves complicated legal and financial issues that can be overwhelming for families. Providing clear solutions and legal support helps simplify these challenges and allows families to manage their property more effectively. Fortunately, for us and so many Americans, I, along with the support of my colleagues, Congressman Emanuel Cleaver of Missouri, Congresswoman Lizzie Fletcher of Texas, and Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida, have introduced bipartisan legislation to remedy this issue. The Heirs Estate Inheritance Resolution and Successions Act seeks to establish a two-pronged grant program to provide legal assistance for heirs property owners to clear titles and incentivizes states to adopt the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act. We can no longer stand by and let families lose their wealth when we have the means and resources to help them to preserve it and build it. Ms. Couch, how can the transformation of heirs property into formal ownership contribute to long-term wealth accumulation and financial security for marginalized communities?
Thank you for the question. And as you spoke, I did remember this issue being a massive issue for families after Katrina, right? This tangled web, no documents, no, the paperwork trail is gone. And I'll note that when we're thinking about an older adult in an aging America, most households have their net wealth from home ownership. And as someone who's worked most of my life on multifamily housing, I can tell you that owning a home matters, and the net wealth that you gain from owning a home, it really makes a big difference. The median net wealth of a homeowner at retirement age is $499,000. The median net wealth of the average renter at retirement age is $11,000. And so there's this multiple of, 50, right? And those are resources that people can rely on to pay for long-term services and supports, because that's a whole other conversation about how we need financing reform there. But having clear title, having clear ownership will allow people that security they need, not just to pass on resources to their children and grandchildren, but to pay for them for their needs as they age.
And Ms. Couch, I am out of time, but I am glad to follow up with our witnesses to provide more information as we continue to seek to move this bipartisan legislation to get this cleared up for so many Americans, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Garbarino, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing. Thank you to all the witnesses for being here. Mr. Harris, it's good to see you. We spent some time together last week. I wanted to ask you about the National Association of Home Builders recently put out an interesting study that seeks to qualify the costs of government regulations to new single-family homes. Not only do onerous regulations make development more expensive, but they also have added the effect of delaying projects, which has its own costs. Has there been a trend of increasing regulatory costs in the construction industry over the past few years?
Yes, that trend has been increasing, not only in regulation, but the regulation on suppliers and on labor, since we've seen the costs of labor go up, materials. We've seen local and federal regulations. I mentioned earlier WOTUS, EPA, the Endangered Species Act. Those are at the national level, but locally, requirements from local municipalities and jurisdictions as they both delay or add on other requirements that are onerous.
So these regulations affect you not just during construction, during development too, during the plan.
Oh, absolutely. The development costs have been rising probably faster than the rate of construction as we seek to develop a piece of property. Those meetings that used to have zoning by right now seem to have it by committee. And so we're constantly having hearings and continued hearings as groups of Not in My Backyard or others try to slow down development. So whatever the federal government can do to encourage communities to encourage quality development would be very helpful.
I believe the chairman asked about it before, but I know we talked about it last week. The energy regulation that's being proposed, can you explain what that would do to the costs of a new home?
Certainly. The International Energy Conservation Code 2021, which was put forth as a requirement by HUD and USDA, and now is being considered by FHFA for all the GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which provide financing for 72% of the 30-year financing out there. We believe it's going to cost in the neighborhood of $31,000 for the cost of each house, with a payback of somewhere between 70 and 90 years, depending on who you use. Now, if we were to use what HUD had come up with, the 7,200 plus or minus that they think that is, that's still significant. Our economists tell us for every time you raise the cost of a house $1,000, you lock out approximately 100,000 families. So even using HUD's numbers of 7,000, you're locking out almost 750,000 families from the medium-priced home. That, I think, would go against HUD's mission and definitely outside FHFA's mission.
I appreciate that, and I agree with you very much. Mr. Schamer, following the direction of the administration, the Federal Housing Finance Agency announced a set of tenant protections to address egregious rent increases, as I said, in the enterprise multifamily programs. In your opinion, do these actions and similar pushes for implementing rent controls result in more or less housing being built?
Thank you, Congressman. As I mentioned earlier, any attempts or any regulation that imposes rent controls has well-documented result of cutting back on housing supply. There are many items that have been proposed that go to tenant resident well-being that the industry has already adopted and that we are actively promoting as professional managers who seek to enhance our resident experience. It's good business to enhance the resident experience, but we cannot be adding new housing stock in areas, or certainly it would occur if it was imposed nationally, to have any kind of rent caps that simply have been clearly proven to prohibit and prevent new development.
Now, there's no better place to look than in New York City and what rent control has done there. I'm out of time. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. I now recognize the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Velasquez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Harris, Mr. Schamer, Ms. Couch, if the rising cost of insurance and coverage losses are a problem for all of you members, what recommendations do you have for how we on this committee can work to tackle this problem?
I'll start. Thank you for the question. I mentioned Congresswoman Velasquez that, maybe this committee could look into authorizing HUD to establish a product, an insurance project exclusively for its universe of affordable senior housing programs. The other thing that I think that we need, and this is hard because insurance is a state-regulated product, is more data. We need a lot more data on how rates are and are not truly tied to things like storms and climate resiliency and wellness services and aging, older adult buildings, as well as the neighborhoods in which those properties are, and to what extent discrimination and some sort of redlining is happening. So I think there's quite a bit this committee could do to start to move the needle.
Are you concerned about discrimination?
Our members have heard from insurance carriers that your rates are going up because of the kind of housing you are, because of the kind of people you serve, because of the kind of program you get your subsidy from, and we think those are euphemisms for race and poverty.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer that, Congresswoman, and thank you very much for the question. We find that not only our members are having challenges with insurance products, but the actual customer. We used to say that our customers were dealing with three things: inventory, inflation, and interest rates. And we had to add insurance in the last couple of years because it's actually marking people out of the market. That we have builders that are telling us that they're not selling homes because the insurance rates are a significant portion of the payment now, the PITI. And so we've got to do with that. We, as the National Association of Home Builders, has put together a task group to work with insureds to find out what can we do. What are the things that are making it, and how can we mitigate those? So we recognize it and try to work through that.
And in the letter that your coalition sent to the president, do you mention more resources for pre-disaster mitigation?
Yes, I think...
And increase appropriation for operating expenses?
I think that would be for the multifamily side.
Yes.
I'm sorry, Representative, can you repeat that question, please?
In the letter that you sent to President Biden, did you ask for support for more resources for pre-disaster mitigation and increase appropriation for operating expenses?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And look, I am all for increasing appropriations for operating expenses and pre-disaster mitigation. But the issue is, what are you doing to get the other side? Because I'm sure they will not be supporting this. So what are you doing to talk to the other members on the other side that will never support increasing those type of resources?
Well, Representative, I think, as I said earlier, we share, I think all of us, the objective of keeping housing and making housing affordable for all income levels. Mm-hmm. And so we urge the type of activity and the legislation that is necessary to address this to be a bipartisan effort. Okay. And I'm sure there are always going to be disagreements on some of the means of achieving it, but there's much more that we can agree on.
That by sending a letter to the president asking for these issues or proposing to increase those type of resources that I support and the members on this side support, you need to be aware that the president cannot do it if we don't have the support from the Republicans in this committee.
The gentlelady's time
or
has
the
expired.
Appropriations Committee. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Flood, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the chairman for holding this hearing, which is on an incredibly important topic that I've been spending more time thinking about recently, and those are the barriers to housing development. Housing is an issue of incredible importance, and it's something we need to think really hard about in this committee because housing is always going to be the single largest expense and often the single largest asset for most American families. When we talk about inflation, rising prices, Americans falling behind on their debt, housing is a huge part of that story. I want to compliment Mr. Compton for his testimony today, and I really believe the way to get out of this housing shortage is to simply build more and build in more dense areas. One means of producing affordable homes in a quick manner would be to look at manufactured housing. Mr. Compton, can you speak to the challenges brought to bear by regulations on manufactured housing? And in particular, I'm curious on your thoughts as it relates to the Department of Energy conservation standards for manufactured housing and attempting to preempt what housing and urban development has historically been regulating.
Thank you, Congressman. I think that the issue between HUD and energy is a classic bureaucratic scenario. It is two different agencies who each wish to have their way on the issue, and I think that sight can be lost of ultimately what's trying to be done. One of the great challenges with respect to manufactured housing regulation is that the manufacturing process and other things move faster than the regulations can. And those internecine struggles on what you're going to decide slow it down even further. And I think that relooking at the regulatory process for manufactured housing at HUD and for that matter at Energy is crucial to having a more nimble approach that would do the sorts of things that, as one of your colleagues previously mentioned, to further enable the use of advanced techniques to lower construction costs.
I'll tell you, in my district, the 1st District of Nebraska, we have all these funds and state programs to build affordable homes, and they cost $400,000 by the time you build a stick-built home. And the folks that we're trying to help can't afford a $400,000 house. I want them in a house so they build equity, and maybe we start with a house that costs $175,000 and maybe doesn't have a garage. Figure out how they can live there for 5 or 10 years so that they can graduate into a nicer home instead of renting. And so I am a believer that we need to have one agency overseeing manufactured housing, and my money is on HUD. The second thing I want to ask Mr. Compton, you talked about some of these environmental reviews that go stale and it ends up putting the project backwards. Can you give me an example of something?
Yeah, for instance, Phase 1 environmental reports, which practically every real estate development, whether it has a federal dollar in it or a private dollar in it, will have a Phase 1 environmental report to assess the baseline of where that property is. Well, under guidance from EPA, introducing another agency into the mix, is that lenders and buyers can only reasonably rely upon a Phase 1 report for 6 months. Well, a city, for instance, may ask for an application, and as part of that application, ask for a Phase 1 report. Well, the city may take more than 6 months in order to process the application, and so all of a sudden, even if you get favorable results from the city, then when you go to your construction lender, guess what? You get to do another Phase 1 report all over again. And that's a very simple example. Unfortunately, in more complicated finance, that can happen time after time. And it's not just on the environmental side. You have other things such as market studies, appraisals. All of these have a shelf life. And it is a little bit like, I sometimes say, it's like cooking breakfast.
And you've done a great job in your testimony talking about some of the barriers. If you were sitting on this dais here and could wave a wand, what's the single best thing that Congress could do to help housing development and supply in the United States, understanding that state and local authorities are really on the front line? What's the number one thing we could do?
As I mentioned in my opening statement, I would remove passive activity loss limits from the Internal Revenue Code to enable private investors and small businesses to invest in residential real estate in their home markets, give them a financial incentive to go to the people who they elect, who they contribute money to locally, to help peel back some of the unreasonable regulations that impede the cost of housing.
Thank you, Mr. Compton. My time is up. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Eliminating unnecessary regulatory burdens is a worthy goal. I get it. But we must also not lose sight of the fact that stewardship of public funds, getting the corporate welfare line, right? You're asking us to finance it, that it often demands us to have fair and effective regulations. In 1973, early disability rights legislation known as the Rehabilitation Act was passed. Section 504 of the bill ensured that people with disabilities couldn't be excluded from programs that receive federal assistance. Yet activists and advocates had to push for years for Section 504 regulations to actually be implemented, even going as far as having to do sit-ins and occupy federal buildings across the nation to get us to do what we promised. Today, one of the regulations still being fought right now is the proposed affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. So Senior Vice President Couch, can you please discuss, and I think it's important for all the folks that do this work, what it means for people, especially our neighbors living with disabilities, who have faced over and over again discrimination, including, again, in regards to the importance of implementing, going as far as trying to support affirmatively furthering fair housing rule.
So in yet another, thank you for the question, Congresswoman, in yet another attempt to really put some teeth and to move forward on the Fair Housing Act's authority to for HUD to push for affirmatively furthering fair housing, this administration in January of 2023, I think it was, proposed its version of affirmatively furthering rules, and Leading Age submitted comments to that proposed rule in support of the administration's efforts. What affirmatively furthering fair housing means in this iteration, or would mean if we could ever get it actually enacted and enforced, is that communities, and I think now housing authorities and multifamily providers like our members, we would encourage our members to participate in those processes, would have to demonstrate to HUD that they are actually not just complying with federal fair housing laws around accessibility requirements and other classes that are regularly discriminated against, but that they are furthering the efforts to meet the gap in where those housing needs are in their community, or risk HUD funds being pulled back. And we've done a lot of talk about, the federal government does this, you get that. The federal government does this.
Banks do that all the time.
Right, and so there's a quid pro quo there, right? We have lots of goals, and some of them include furthering fair housing goals.
And I'll tell you, I don't think, Republican, Democrat, whatever you political, I don't think any of us have had a coffee hour outreach where we didn't have one of our disabled neighbors talking about housing issues and discrimination and not getting access. I do want to quickly talk about the new energy standards, which everyone is continuing to talk about. I know a single family owner might see an annual mortgage payment go up by, $247, but the annual energy savings will be about $751, meaning they'll save over $14,000 over a lifetime of their property on average. With the new energy standards, a family living in low, rise multifamily unit can save up to $314 annually on energy costs. And I'll tell you, I watch GTE. I think they're on their fourth. This is the energy. They're already increasing. I think this is the fourth increase in the year that we've been seeing. Again, it's gone to the point where we're seeing more record shutoffs and stuff. So, Vice President Couch, in a written statement, you mentioned how older households served by HUD Section 202 program have an annual income of just a little bit over $16,000. For someone in that situation, what might be better building standards mean for their physical and financial health?
Quite a bit. As I understand these new minimum energy standards coming from USDA and EPA, which again just apply to the federally backed programs, we're going to see those reduced energy cost savings for residents, and that's going to matter deeply in their pocketbooks when they have so little residual income left over after they do pay their rent. We're going to see increased resident health because of those air quality issues we mentioned a little while ago. We do think that buildings will be much more resilient to climate change and weather events, which will bring down the cost to the federal government to repair those and rebuild those buildings. And generally, we see decreased climate change, and those can benefit all of us.
And I really truly believe if you're getting federal financing or support, I think it's okay to ask for something in return, especially protections for our residents. I yield.
Thank you. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, and we've discussed here, housing affordability is a serious crisis in our nation right now. I've heard various numbers, including that we are well over 6.5 million units underbuilt at the moment. With mortgage rates at multi-decade highs, limited supply, and continued supply chain and construction issues, for many it is the most difficult time to purchase a home in a generation. The market is further complicated by the extraordinary circumstances of many homeowners unable to sell their home for fear of losing their low fixed rate mortgage obtained prior to the rapid increase in interest rates. These, among other factors, have forced many potential home buyers into the rental market, driving up rental demand and prices with it. In Rockland and Westchester counties, which I represent, according to the National Association of Realtors, the monthly cost of a mortgage is $1,000 more today than it was last year, and in Putnam and Dutchess counties, it is at least $800 more per month. In both instances, these are an additional housing costs of almost $10,000 or more a year. For many families, it's totally unsustainable. And this topic is critical, which is why we need to be working together as elected officials, government agencies, nonprofit organizations, local stakeholders, and key figures from industries like real estate, development, and construction and insurance. Mr. Harris and Mr. Schamer, obviously the higher interest rate environment is a significant challenge for potential home buyers and sellers alike in the current market. Many current homeowners have rates at or below 3%, with many aspiring buyers quoted nearly 7 or 8% this year. This lock-in effect, if you will, has been widely reported and is something we hear about from our constituents frequently. Can you speak to this lock-in effect and its impact on both buyers and sellers? Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Congressman Lawyer. I really appreciate the question. It's definitely out there. We're seeing the rapid increase in cash buyers, those who have additional cash that can do that, but it doesn't help in the affordable or first-time home buyers, but the lock-in effect truly is stymieing the market. We can see right now the percentage of new homes sold of the total housing market is at the highest it's ever been because no one is putting existing homes on the market, and so we seem to be the only game in town. But again, those rising costs, we continue to encourage those to invest now because we know prices are going to continue to rise and interest rates will go down, or as some people say, marry the house, date the rate, right?
Mr. Schamer?
Congressman Lawler, thank you for the question. In the for rent space, the circumstances are slightly different, but the impact has a huge impact on people's affordability and their ability to relocate. It's estimated that this year, new apartment starts on construction will have fallen by at least 35%. That's a Census Bureau estimate. Industry estimates are greater than that. That results in fewer homes being available for people to rent in coming years. The cost of capital as a result of the increase in interest rates has had a huge impact on that dramatic drop in new construction and new development. Furthermore, the value of properties has fallen for investment properties has fallen as a result of that cost of financing, such that it costs more to build a new apartment home today than the apartment home is often worth when it's completed. And again, that's adding to that supply issue that we're all trying to address.
So, basics, supply and demand question. Obviously, 6.5 million units underbuilt. I think all of us, Republicans and Democrats, can agree we have not built the number of houses needed to fulfill the demand in recent decades. What impact does increasing demand but not supply have on costs in the market, especially for entry-level housing units?
I think we know the answer to the question, which is it drives up the cost, right? So if you have, and we've seen it in the past, we've seen two buyers going after one house, which drives up the cost. So if you incentivize a third buyer, now you've added to that mix three bidding on the same house. So if we don't increase inventory or build, baby, build, we've got a problem.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you to the chairman and to the ranking member and to our witnesses for appearing before us today to really discuss solutions to the single most pressing issue facing people in my district in Nevada and people all across the country, which is the lack of affordable housing. The constituents that I serve in Southern Nevada are struggling as they face household expenses that are 13% higher than the national average. Increased household expenses that are predominantly driven by the outsized effect of ballooning housing cost. We are still dealing with the fact that single-family housing rents in Southern Nevada are estimated at an astonishing 40% above the 2019 rates. The market for single-family homes isn't any better, as the median sale price in the metro area has soared to $445,000. And I worry that at a time when hardworking Nevada families are facing high prices and low supply, when looking for a home, they're confronted with yet the impossible challenge of competing for such a limited number of homes. We have an acute issue with out-of-state corporate landlords, as they are buying up homes in Southern Nevada at the second fastest growing rate of all major communities in the country in the first quarter of this year. While interest rates remain high, these institutional buyers are making all cash offers that my constituents simply cannot compete with. This artificial contrition of our housing supply is only exacerbating the impacts of the woeful lack of construction that has occurred. A unique constraint we face is the vast swaths of federally managed land within our state that cannot currently be utilized for development. I'm glad that the President has recognized the complication this adds to our affordable housing challenge, and with their announcement last week, which identified nearly 600 acres of land in Southern Nevada for development. This is a great start, but this is a statewide issue. The rural counties that I represent are just as deserving of relief, and I'll continue to call on the Biden-Harris administration to reduce federal regulations, to expedite permitting, and to ease constraints for housing that can be built affordably on public lands. But even without this challenge, there still aren't enough single-family homes to meet demand, and incentivizing new construction must be our top priority on this subcommittee. Mr. Harris, I've recently spoken with my Southern Nevada home builders regarding the upfront cost of compliance with the 2021 IECC. What do you recommend that we do to strike a better balance between our crucial climate goals and our desperate need for availability of new homes?
Thank you very much, Congressman, for not only those comments, but for the question. I think you're absolutely right. I think the balance is we need to look at what we're producing right now. The homes that we're producing in Nevada, in Kansas, are the most efficient, most sustainable homes that have ever been built in this country under current codes. And so the incremental increase, and I can only give you anecdotal information from my own community in Wichita, in which we build approximately 1,200 new homes a year. And I stood up in my local association and said, we're building the most efficient homes. And a representative from the local utility stood up and said, Carl's absolutely right. Even though we've added 2,400 new homes in the Wichita community, there has not been an incremental increase in the use of electricity from the residential market.
Thank you.
So what that's telling us is what we're doing is good now.
Thank you. Another issue that I'm very concerned about, and I just sent a letter along with Senator Rosen, requesting additional resources be provided to our local housing authorities, such as increased allocations of housing choice vouchers and the flexibility to make the programs fit local challenges. We need new housing funding, and we need to make the necessary changes to our existing housing programs so that they work for every community. We need to invest in our nation's housing stock, and I'm committed to working with all of you to implement the strategies to incentivize new construction that we've discussed today. However, in order to address the dire need for support that I can see throughout Southern Nevada every day, we need changes to increase the efficiency of the programs that already exist and to expand the selection processes so that they include more of those who struggle with housing instability. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I'd like to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. Without objection, I'd like to enter the following documents into the record. First, the leasing process comparison chart that I referenced at the start of the hearing. Second, the San Francisco toilet gate article from the New York Times that I referenced in my opening statement. And finally, I'd like to enter into the record the Biden administration's fiscal year 2025 HUD budget, which shows that its request to cut Section 202 program from the enacted $1.075 billion budget down 14% to $931 million. So this is a cut proposed by the Biden-Harris administration for the elderly housing program. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional material and written questions to witnesses to the chairman, which will be forwarded to witnesses for their response. I ask witnesses, if so forwarded, please respond as promptly as you're able. This hearing stands adjourned.